Perhaps the most useful course I took during my seminary studies was a course on preaching, not the standard seminary preaching course that instructs students on how to shape and write a sermon, but a course taught by the director of the University of Chicago Theater that was intended to help students with sermon delivery. As the director noted, we students might have believed that because we were speaking words of great truth in our sermons, that the words alone would suffice to make them heard and understood. But we would be wrong in that belief. For a poorly delivered sermon, he said, would never be heard no matter how much truth it carried. To work with us, the director had each student deliver about 5 minutes of a sermon, after which he offered comments about everything from stance behind the pulpit to hand gestures to rhythms of speaking. He was a gifted mimic, which meant he did not just tell us what he observed, he acted it out for us, thereby ensuring we would forever retain that cringe-worthy image. Now, because by then I had already benefited from some speech competitions in high school and I'd heard I was good at delivering reports in classes, I expected to hear from the director minor criticism and considerable praise. I finished my 5 minutes of sermonizing, and the director made a couple of generally complimentary observations, then moved into the heart of his critique. I suffered, so he said, from an excess of lugubriosity. He then gave a demonstration, saying that because I regarded every word I spoke as laden with meaning, I was putting my congregation through an ordeal that would exhaust them within 5 minutes because each word was like being hit with a brick. He advised me to believe that it was actually fine to only occasionally have a weighty word, to include humor and simple descriptions along with all my excess truth. As I began preparing today's sermon, I could feel my old lugubrious self trying to take over. After all, this is the last sermon I will give you until fall. It comes at the end of a transitional year. It is the last sermon I will give as a full-time minister, and it just invites lots of weighty words. But the director was right about exhausting a congregation when I overload with impact what I'm saying. So as I cast about for how to make this sermon one you could take to heart without resorting to lugubriosity, I decided to call on help. I brought along my pink Jesus to assist me with the sermon. This was a gift from congregants in my last settled ministry who wanted me to have a wise companion for all my future ministry, and I can tell you this pink Jesus has served me well. It's like a child's magic 8-ball toy. You ask Jesus a question, shake him a bit, and then there's So for this morning, I came up with some questions that I'm holding as we finish this first transitional year, and some questions I've heard you asking. I'll pose a question to Jesus, and then I'll read off his answer, and also offer a bit of interpretation since this pink Jesus, like the actual Jesus, tends to speak in terms that are often difficult to understand and require some exegesis. So, with Jesus here to accompany me, the first question: why are we here? An important question to ask in a time of transition when so many things are changing, both things we want to change and things we had hoped would never change, so that we're thrown back on the essentials. And what is more essential than being clear on why we're here? So let's see what Jesus says. And Jesus says, for Christ's sake. Well, I guess I can see a couple or three ways to unpack that answer. Maybe it's a call to see ourselves as being here to live out the values Jesus taught, to feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, love the hopeless. But I kind of think we're already doing some of that. Maybe Jesus is challenging us to dig deeper and double our efforts. Given that we've passed the 8th principle, we're now supposed to be moving from nice words to real actions. And Jesus may be ready for us to get cracking, to be the congregation people around us think of whenever they think of a congregation that is actually walking its talk. For Christ's sake might also be the casual meaning of the phrase, such as when we respond in an exasperated tone, for Christ's sake already. Maybe the pink Jesus is tired of a bunch of people fretting about our purpose, wordsmithing mission statements, and instead wants us to just get on with the work. Well, I don't know that that was a particularly enlightening effort, but rather than blame Jesus, perhaps the fault was in my question, because asking good questions is a skill. So I'll try again. This time, my question being one that ministers who consider applying here will be asking: what is this congregation's great gift? Its unique strength? And Jesus replies, no way in hell. Now that answer strikes me as quite the opposite of how I might have responded if asked what is this congregation's greatest strength. To say no way in hell implies a kind of unrelenting rejection, which would say that this would be a congregation that closes ranks, circles the wagons, refuses to admit new people and ideas, is allergic to even the slightest change a newcomer might bring. Having been a newcomer myself just a year ago, that's not the way I have experienced you. But perhaps what Jesus is pointing to is something deeper than simply being a bunch of friendly people. The Universalist side of our tradition declared that all of us were already saved, that nobody was being judged or condemned to everlasting punishment in hell because a loving God would not treat humanity that way. To say then that your greatest strength here is summed up in the statement, no way in hell, promises that in this place, among these people, nobody is rejected, Nobody is required to demonstrate their worthiness to be here. Whoever comes to the door of this congregation is greeted as an honored guest. In a world where the usual reaction to strangers or people who look and sound and act different from cultural norms is fear, condemnation, a door slammed shut, a border wall built, laws passed to keep you out and make sure you stay in your place. In the sort of world we seem to inhabit now, for you to be a community of radical welcome, where there is no talk of hell, either theologically or culturally, that is truly a gift. Well, Jesus seems to have upped his game a little bit, so I will up the ante and ask a tricky question and see what he has to say. A few weeks ago, I suggested that just as relationships always have a core conflict, an abiding issue or argument that shows up in different guises but is always the same, so that couples actually fight about just one thing over and over, the same thing is true of congregations. Each congregation has its core issue. It's one fight that comes up repeatedly, perhaps starting with some particular matter, but ultimately being the same conflict. I invited you to consider what you think your one fight, your abiding conflict has been. Let's see what Jesus might say about that. Jesus, what is this congregation's central issue? The place where it gets stuck again and again. Jesus is insisting on giving two answers. The little thing has two answers in it, and he won't settle on one of them, so I guess I'm stuck with both of them. Okay, the first of those two answers Jesus gives is, beware the lightning. In terms of how that might pertain to your central conflict, what about this? Lightning can be a symbol of sudden and unexpected inspiration. We sometimes describe a startling new idea that surfaces as being a bolt out of the blue. You are a creative bunch with no shortage of inspiration striking you. But over time, as I've listened to stories you tell about the path this congregation has traveled, you seem to struggle to let those inspirations take root, to be willing to risk living into them. You have many wonderful traditions here, many ways of doing things that have been in place a long time. Traditions can calcify, though, and prevent fresh perspectives from emerging. When lightning strikes someone here, when someone says, "How about if we tried?" is that person more likely to hear, "Great, what do you need to get started with that?" Or to hear, "Well, that would need to be discussed," and people brought into the conversation, and there'll be those who will object, and all the ways that we turn aside from lightning. Are you able to support a bolt of lightning that comes along with the threat, as lightning does, to upend things? And the second answer Jesus gave was, resist the devil. I wonder if some kind of devil, certainly not the mythological devil, but a more insidious kind of devil, enters here whenever an inspiration rises, when there's a chance to do something bold, something different. And the devil shows up with those powerful devil statements that circulate in churches of all kinds. Statements like, we did this before and it didn't work. Or, we've always done it this way. Or, why are we just now hearing about this? Or, who made these changes? Well, congregations often struggle to be open to new possibilities, and congregations of all kinds are notoriously risk-averse, despite all the preaching they give about faith. This congregation here seems to come right up to the edge of some new direction, some bold plan, some departure from the way things have been done, in order to experiment with a very different way of doing things. And the devil begins to whisper all the reasons it cannot possibly work. There will not be enough money. People will be unhappy. We come to church to be in the one place in our lives where nothing is changing because everything else is changing. All those wonderful reasons for ignoring an inspiration. And so your core conflict comes up, the perception that you cannot do what you envision or it will not work, and you back away. The lightning dies, the devil wins. When will you be ready to change up Sunday mornings, to develop a plan for your building money, to take a risky public stand, and along with that, accept and live with the discomfort that accompanies those ventures, and not quickly interpret discomfort as meaning something's wrong and you should stop. The ministers who will be looking at you next year are looking for a congregation where, in their words, a congregation where there is healing and growth and transformation. Those are the abiding desires ministers talk about in search these days. Healing, growth, transformation. All words that are filled with the dynamics of change. Do those qualities describe you? Because ministers will not come here looking for what is sometimes called maintenance ministry, where they are warmly welcome to join you and told, but don't touch anything. Can you be open to being struck by lightning? Can you be willing to resist the devil? Because both of those options will absolutely upend the way things are. Well, Jesus hopefully spared me from descent into lugubriosity, but I'm not sure how much insight he's given, because he's been pretty oblique in his answers, which I gather was Jesus' style. I do have one more question for him, a question I've heard circulating among you as you stand on the cusp between the congregation you have been and the congregation you will become. It's an obvious question. It's also an impossible question, but Jesus seemed undaunted by impossible questions. So I asked Jesus, what happens next? The stories of Jesus depicted him sometimes talking about what he saw coming, so I would think he could answer such a question for us. And he says, of course, believe. And of course he would say such a thing, because ultimately it is probably the only answer when any of us wants to know what's ahead for us, what's ahead tomorrow, what's ahead in work and relationships, what's ahead for us in our living in our dying. So little of any of that is in our control ever, which means there is not much left for us but to believe. To believe that we will, in the end, have the strength and resources to deal with whatever comes our way. To believe that we can, in the end, count on the people who love us to offer us strength and resources for the journey. To believe that we can, in the end, trust God, trust the universe, trust life itself to be fundamentally good. We believe and we take the next step. And maybe along with our pink Jesus nearby, we also keep one another nearby, so that when we are lost, as we will be, we know that we are not lost by ourselves. And we can tell one another all the ways we have found that do not work, and then in all that, find our way home. May it be so. Amen.